Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. This service is How Super Were Super Aguri. I'm your driver, Peter Brook, and your conductors today are Ciaron Smith and a new guest, fellow historian of F1, Aidan Millward. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi
Thank
there.
you. Glad to be back, and pleasure to be here with Aidan as well.
It's not often I get to be on a podcast, so it's always good to talk to somebody that's not my wife for a change.
Indeed, yeah. We thought you'd bring on for this one because Super Aguri. I don't know about you, but they're one of my favourite teams, as maybe the shirt might give away. They were my HRT before HRT existed. Quite a unique team in terms of how they operated. I suppose the way I'd describe it was being like Honda's Toro Rosso, because they were sort of started as basically a B team and pretty much an excuse to give Takuma Sato a seat because he'd been dropped by BAR and they're like, well, he's really popular, we need to keep him on, so let's build a team for him. I suppose one place to start though is the namesake Super Aguri is because the team was actually built by Aguri Suzuki. So he was an ex F1 driver. He raced late 80s, early 90s. His most famous moment would be getting his podium Japan 1990, courtesy of Prost and Senna, giving us what might be the only non-European podium in F1, if I'm correct, I think.
It's a good shout, actually. I mean, back in the 50s, you would have had Fangio, obviously South American, unless there was one from the 60s that had maybe Brabham, Hallman's Gurney.
Potentially, yes.
But that's the only other time it could have happened, but those are stats that I don't really remember. There's probably somebody listening that is just a repository of statistics that could probably tell us, but
I'm pretty certain
that's the only time I can think of it happening.
I'm pretty certain it is the first one because it's him, PK Moreno, so two Brazilians and Japanese. Since then, even since then, I don't think there have been any examples I could think of. You'd have to find ones that have had a mixture of like Massa and Weber and people like that. But yeah, I don't think there are any others at all.
Yeah, there's a few with Montoya and Barrichello, but nothing with.
Yeah, but the other one would usually be Schumacher, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So.
But yeah, that was the main highlight of his 6 or 7 year F1 career. He seemed to be connected to Yamaha mostly because this is the thing about Japanese drivers. They usually have some kind of connection to an engine manufacturer, which is how they get into F1. So as I mentioned before, with Sato, it was Honda. With Tsunoda at the moment, it's Honda. With Kobayashi, it was Toyota. Same with Kazuki Nakajima. With Shinji Nakano, it was Mugen Honda. But with him, it was Yamaha. But then he left Formula One 1995. He retired immediately after the Japanese Grand Prix because he crashed in qualifying and broke his neck, I think, in a crash. And he was like, I'm not doing this anymore. But then he went into team management. So he did. He was already quite well known because he did ARTA for a few years, and they raced in Super GT. And then this opportunity came up to run Super Aguri, and he just kind of ran with it pretty much.
Yeah, and on top of that, you also had Takuma Sato, who was there. Probably in terms of like popularity within a country, probably their Schumacher, not so much in terms of like success in Formula One, but certainly like their Schumacher, their Verstappen, their Senna, in terms of how much they were loved by the public. But then he lost his drive at the end of 2005 because Honda brought in Barrichello to partner Button instead. And they basically went, well, we need this guy in Formula One because he's so much value to Honda. So let's find some way of creating a new team so that he's able to have a seat. Which, looking at the Andretti stuff now, probably wouldn't happen today, would it? Because what's Super Aguri bringing to the sport other than a guy that's loved in just one country?
Yeah. I feel like it's one of these things where, a team, basically killed two birds with one stone in the sense that it allowed them to keep Sato. And then it was also probably beneficial to Honda because it acted somewhat as a B team for them as well. So they thought, hang on, we can keep marketing, our popular driver for our Honda products, and we can also have a little bit more influence through a B team as well. So probably looked beneficial on paper.
It's not the first time that they've created a team to serve a particular driver's interest, if you want to call it that, because Brabham was basically set up to give that Oscar Larrauri guy a seat in Formula One because he was like 33 going on 34, not been in Formula One. The odds of him getting there were diminishing. He was supposed to be Argentina's next big thing after Fangio. So to set up a team to support one particular guy has been done before. And even before Eurobron, it had been done. A couple of other times it had been done. So, but to have this team in Formula One that was Honda's B team, but then the drivers they had weren't exactly B team material because they never would have made it to the A team because of their lack of talent or whatever it may be.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously that it was built for Sato, but then he had just been dropped by the A team because he'd been with BAR since 2003. 2004, when they had a very strong car, his teammate Jenson Button got 10 podiums and a pole position. Sato got 1 podium. And then in 2005, he scored 1 point, and I think Button scored 37. And that was in a season where the first half of the year they scored nothing, and they had their famous, extra fuel tank fiasco at Imola, and then got a 2-race ban. But then from Manicourt onwards, I think Button scored in every remaining race, but Sato scored just a single point, and they were like, okay, we can't keep this guy on. But they built this team for him, and then the first person they looked at actually to get as his second driver was Anthony Davidson, and he was somebody who'd been with, let's call them Team Brackley, since 2000. He'd been a test driver for BAR for a long time. In 2004, he was famously got to wear a lot of very inventive liveries on his car because he would drive the third car on Friday. And so there was that 555 blue and yellow livery in China that for the Chinese sponsors. There was another one that was like an X-ray of the car with like a cross section of his driving position on the side. And then they also did one of that looked like it had been left in some dodgy part of town and covered in like spray paint and everything and vandalized. So quite unique designs. I mean, they've got one up on modern liveries in that they actually had paint on them. He was their first choice, but then Suzuki was like, well, actually, no, this is a Japanese team. I want Japanese drivers. Enter Yuji Ide, this 31-year-old man who had been racing professionally for 11 years at this point, near enough, since the mid-90s. He did 1 year, I think 2002, he raced in French Formula 3, but otherwise he'd only raced in Japan. I think he finished runner-up in Formula Nippon 1 year, and he'd won a couple of races, so not that bad on paper, could be worse. But then everyone was like, who is this guy? We've never heard of him, and he's 31 years old, which is pretty old for a rookie, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, what you're calling Formula Nippon is now Super Formula. It was sort of rebranded, rehashed. I've just got his racing career up on the epic repository that is Wikipedia. It stretches back to 1994. Did 6 races in All Japan Formula 3, and it's just a mess of non-classifieds because he didn't do that many races or get that many points. 1999 All Japan GT Championship, which is now Super GT, second. Formula Dream, whatever that is, it says just was an open wheel racing series based in Japan. It was replaced by Formula Challenge Japan in 2006. He won that. But what's funny here is that you know how when you look at these stats when you're doing your own videos, Peter, where it's just like, okay, he's done this many races, he's scored this many points, blah, blah, blah. Races, question mark. Wins, races, question mark. Wins 1, poles, question mark. Points, question mark. Somehow won the championship. The guy must have been good if he's able to break statistics like that, but the rest of it is just a mess because I'm looking at All Japan GT, 22nd overall, but he only did 1 race. All Japan Formula 3 in 2001, 18th and 5th. So he's kind of like, he's just outside of the top 5 in Japan, which, no disrespect to Japanese racers, really, you need to be in the top of the Japanese races to really be considered good enough to make it to Formula One or even come to Europe. But he's just the results he's got just aren't. There's nothing here that's standing out to make me go, yeah, this guy's good. Other than Formula Nippon 2004, where he finished third, and then Formula Nippon second in 2005. But his only championship win came in 1999, and then nothing really until 2006 when he joined Formula One, where it says here, Super Aguri, 4 races entered, which is a meme in itself, as many content creators have covered over the years.
Because basically every other Japanese driver in Formula One at that point had won some kind of major title. They'd won what at the time would have been called All Japan Formula 3, or they would have moved to Europe and maybe won one of the European titles. And he hadn't done that. I mean, even like Takagi and Nakano, they had titles before getting to Formula One. And obviously Sato did. I mean, Sato's junior career was very short, actually, because he started karting at 19, and then he entered Formula One when he was 25. So he rushed things quite considerably, which gave me hope as a teenager when I was 16. I was like, I want to be an F1 driver, because Sato started at 19. But that never went anywhere, unsurprisingly. But it wasn't someone like he bought like a huge amount of sponsorship either. I think it was literally, I want Japanese drivers, so we're going to have this guy. And that was what they did.
Yeah, he just took the only guy that was available, really. I mean, even Taki Inui made it to England and sort of managed to talk his way into a team. But I think it was basically a case of, this guy's got some money, maybe, because I can't really find out who his sponsors were at the time.
It's just a classic case of, I think, the Japanese sponsors, the Japanese board wanting a Japanese driver at all costs. And, in the case of Sato, it's somewhat understandable. To your earlier point, Sato had he started late. But remember, he was a brilliant bike champion, wasn't he? He was an absolute maverick on 2 wheels. And that's what people thought. If you're that good on 2 wheels, why don't you switch over to 4? So Sato wasn't completely, just a paid driver in that sense. And so even though he had a tough 2005, him going to Super Aguri was somewhat palatable to fans because he was a talented driver. He was popular. It's unfortunate that they didn't see that they didn't need to put other drivers in from the Japanese mold to fill that void. I always thought that, the likes of Ide and people like that were just, they're just unnecessary. If you're that unbelievably unqualified, as Aidan, pointed out with those stats earlier, those are not really F1 caliber junior stats, right? So it must be a marketing decision.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry. It's it looks like the two of them just knew each other. Apparently, they've known each other for quite a while, so maybe that had something to do with it. It's a case of you just know the guy rather than he's got the credentials.
Yeah.
So it meant that they got these 2 drivers. I think there was a bit of a hiccup actually getting onto the grid. Everything was done at the very very last minute, it was around November December time of 2005. They were still trying to get things finalized for their entry for 2006. I think at first their first application was rejected because Suzuki basically forgot to pay the entry fee, and then they also had this blocked by I think you needed a unanimous vote from every other team to be accepted onto the grid, and Midland actually blocked it, who were one of the new-ish because they just bought out Jordan, and they said no the first time, but then they got the entry. They've got 2 drivers. They don't have a car. And so what they ended up doing instead of building their own one, their first attempt was that they would buy BAR's 2005 car and use that. But because BAR still owned or Honda as they were now still owned the intellectual property rights, they couldn't do that. So what they did instead was to buy the Arrows A23, which had gone through a bit of a shift in its appearance and usage, because so that was Arrow's 2002 car, their final car. Mid-season, they folded. After that, all 5 A23 chassis were purchased by Paul Stoddart of Minardi. And he basically trialed them to think, okay, maybe this is a better option than our 2003 car. And then they tested them with Jos Verstappen. And he was like, this is actually better than our car. And he wanted to race them in 2004, but then he thought, actually, I don't think people would like us stealing another team's car and just running it and pretending it's a Minardi. So they modified it a bit, and we got the PS04B, which they used in 2004, which ended up being no better than any other car they had in their final few years. And then Aguri just bought 4 of these. They took out the Cosworth V10 and threw in a Honda V8. Bam, you've got the Super Aguri SA05. This is not something we've seen for. It's not even, you can't do that anymore, but it's not something we've seen for a very long time from an F1 team.
It's outrageous in a way. I mean, I'm not really sure why these teams go down this route, because yes, it gets them on the grid, but if I'm sitting there in Super Aguri's, let's say management circle, which is probably very connected to Honda, but what is exactly the point of filling an entry that is already behind from a technical perspective by that much? And I look at it like that anyways, because they're not building their own car, right, as you pointed out, Peter, and as everyone's pointed out today, they effectively have very limited upside as a result, and certainly the drivers don't exactly light the world on fire either. So to me, it's just an odd one, because I'm not going to say it was doomed from the start, but it wasn't far off that in my view. And I just don't see that as a sustainable business model going forward. The way that they did things. I mean, if they had some degree of original design or some degree of sustainability, then fine. But it just strikes me as something that was always going to somewhat crash and burn, even from the way they started.
I think as well at that time, though, the Formula One regulations were a lot more stable than they are today. I think it would have been a lot easier to adapt a car from 2002 to 2006 than it would be to adapt a 2018 to a 2021, just because of now the way that things just evolve so quickly, and the aerodynamic complexity of the cars now is so much bigger, and the computers involved and the data involved is so much bigger that they didn't have back then, that it would have just been easy to go, okay, we've got this car from 2002. Well, the 2005 regulations say that we've got to move that front wing up by another 3 or 4 inches or whatever it is. So they just build a new front wing. Done. And then it's getting everything else to work with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it'd been the changes weren't so strong at the time, because I know that 2002 they were still allowed to use traction control and automatic transmission and launch control. The last two, automatic transmission, launch control, those were banned in 2004. 2005, I think they changed the ride height, or they changed the height of the front wing to reduce downforce. Obviously, the big change here is the move from V10s to V8s, because 2006 was the first year of V8s. This was an issue because, as I mentioned before, the Arrows A23 had a Cosworth V10. It was built for that. When they put the Honda in, the Honda V8 in, it wouldn't fit. So they had to basically completely rejig the drivetrain so that it would actually line up with the gearbox. So that meant that the car ended up having a very high center of gravity, because the engine just didn't sit as low as it should have done. There were some very, very minor modifications they did to the aero of the car. I mean, it still featured, because one of the distinctive parts of the Arrows car was that it had twin keel front suspension mountings, which is something that Sauber actually had pioneered the year before. So they came up with that, and they kept that. So that was a lot of the ways you could still recognize that it was an Arrows. They did some testing, not very much. Times weren't very good, and then they come to Bahrain to begin the season. And I think these first few races, I think what most merits discussion is Ide, because he lasted 4 races, but they were 4 very memorable races.
Yes, they were. He was totally unqualified from the beginning. I remember I think it was one of the qualifying sessions in Australia that season. I mean, he was just spinning like a top.
Yeah.
So,
I've got the Bahrain Grand Prix stats up. The only reason Ide wasn't at the back of the grid was because Raikkonen didn't set a time and Montero started from the pit lane. But even then, I think this was actually the first season of the three-stage qualifying session that we still see today. His first session time was 7 seconds slower than Schumacher, which even by 2006 standards, where the grid was a bit more spread out than it is now, is ridiculous. That's borderline sort of like Williams 96 versus 40. Those kinds of teams and drivers, but it was the drivers probably weren't the worst that the world has ever seen. It was just that the cars were utterly terrible, and you would get them not qualifying and stuff like that. 96 was the first year of the 107%. That's why 40 kind of really had the nails put in the coffin there. But 7 seconds off and 3 seconds off your own teammate, and they say your teammate's your first competitor. That's just, I don't think we've ever seen anything like that since.
Yeah, it's just not good enough, is it? I mean, there's a limit to the power of marketing, which is eventually offset by, a horrific lack of performance. And that's what we were seeing. Frankly, it's a danger to the other drivers to have somebody that much slower as well. It's unpredictable. Other drivers aren't expecting that. Yeah.
Well, that's what undid Damon Hill towards the end of 1999. He was just like trying to get out of everybody's way because he knew he wasn't enjoying it anymore. But because he was so focused on looking in his mirrors and trying to move out of everybody's way at the start to avoid a crash, he's more likely to cause a crash doing that. And even then, it's like safety is still a hot priority, and it's drivers like Ide why they've brought in the super license points and things like that. I know it's not like it's 15 years later that they started bringing it in, but back in the day where you could just really buy a super license. I mean, that some drivers weren't given one, like Sebastian Loeb. Sebastian Loeb was never given a super license because he didn't have an experience in open wheelers. But someone like Yuji Ide, I don't want to single out just Ide. There have been other drivers that have come through that have effectively just been able to buy licenses when arguably one of the greatest drivers that ever lived couldn't get one.
It's outrageous, isn't it? It's outrageous. Go ahead, Peter.
I think another thing that needs mentioning is, of course, back in 2006, the teams had essentially unlimited testing mileage, which these days we don't have. So Ide, they did some testing at Barcelona in an unmodified car, and then they brought the official car, which had the new livery and had some actual aerodynamic modifications, to Silverstone for a shakedown, but they couldn't run because it was snowing. So Ide, his testing mileage was actually probably not that far off what the current drivers get because we only got 3 days of testing this year. So you could compare it to somebody like, say, Logan Sargent, who would have only had a few days testing in Bahrain last year before he made his debut. But then even before that, he was doing Formula 2 and he did a couple of FP1 sessions. So he had a bit more preparation, and they had simulators, which they wouldn't have had at the time. So he, compared to most other people, he did a tiny amount of testing. When you consider that, say, Lewis, for example, before his debut a year later, he did a ton of testing and had loads of preparation time. And Ide just didn't get that. But in the race itself, he got a drive-through penalty almost immediately, but not because of anything he'd done. It's because his mechanics were still on the grid like 15 seconds before the lights went out to start the formation lap. So that put him miles back, and then he ended up. It was a funny race because you could tell that they hadn't done any actual pit stop practice. Because Sato, he did 5 pit stops because the fuel rig just wouldn't work and they couldn't get it to put any fuel in. Ide did 1, and he managed to run over the pit mechanics because he couldn't put the car in neutral. And then it stalled and he got wheeled into the garage and then sent out again. So that was another thing, just the lack of preparation. It was very chaotic first race.
Do you want to know how little preparation they had? Because I found the testing mileage. So this is for the entire of 2006, not just pre-season or anything like that. Honda did, throughout the whole of 2006, 21,355 miles worth of testing. Super Aguri did 1,430. Midland, which was the next least, did 4,222. So they barely did any testing by comparison. They drove essentially a Formula One car from London to Barcelona.
Yeah, and I think most of that was probably just a lack of money, because they did. We'll get to him later, but they did actually have a third driver all signed. It was Franck Montagny, but yeah, just a lack of mileage on. Obviously, weren't able to get him out much beyond doing Friday driving. And it meant that they had no pace and they hadn't done pit stop practice. The second race in Malaysia was better, but they were still. I mean, I remember this one because Ide actually did an overtake. He managed to pass Montero, I think, on the third lap. He got passed again immediately, but still it counts. But even there, he got lapped by Sato by less than the halfway mark, and that just gives you an idea of the difference in pace between the two of them.
Yeah, I'm looking at for the Malaysian Grand Prix as well. It's like he never finished last. You know, when you look at because like at Malaysia, Raikkonen retired on the first lap, then Rosberg's engine blew. Coulthard, Webber, and Clean lost their hydraulics, and then Ide lost his throttle on lap 33. So he was able to go long-ish into the races, but the car's pace and his level just weren't there. I think was it only Australia that he actually did finish? I'm just trying to look now.
That was the only one.
Yeah, he was a lap down on his own teammate who finished in the position ahead. So it's like, okay, he was last on track, but he wasn't last.
Yeah, I mean, because in Malaysia he was running in last when he when he retired. Australia was a funny one because that race had 4 safety cars. I think because there was a crash at the start and then a couple more. Schumacher famously crashed out. A very rare error from him. I mean, you can point that as maybe one of the ways he lost the title that year. There are several places you could point at for that. But the thing again, I think it was 2012 or 2011, they introduced the rule that allowed lap cars to overtake the safety car. And they didn't have that. So they meant there were 4 different safety cars. And for 3 of those, him and Sato were both caught in the middle of front runners, trying to let them through. And Sato had actually, he managed to get ahead of both Midlands. And so he was trying to let fast cars through and not let the Midlands pass him. But even with that, Ide still ended up a lap down, and he still got lapped 3 times, even with 4 safety cars.
Yeah, and it actually says here, after the race, the stewards issued a reprimand to Sato for failing to observe blue flags. And they also gave a 25-second penalty to Scott Speed for failing to heed yellow flags. And Speed was also fined $5,000 for using abusive language during a post-race hearing, which is quite on brand for Scott Speed, considering his antics on iRacing.
That would have been his only point, actually, in F1 as well, because he finished the race in 8th originally. And then gets this penalty, and other than that, he never scored any other points.
Yeah, he finished 9th behind Coulthard because of that.
Yeah, but yeah, that one. I mean, Sato actually finished that race in the pit lane as well, because I think the engine was about to die, and they were like, "Just go in the pit lane. We don't have time to do a cool down lap or anything." But yeah, also in practice, it'd been raining on the Saturday, and so that was the first time they'd ever driven the car in the wet. And that there are pictures. That was when Ide was spinning a lot. I think he blocked a lot of drivers in qualifying because of that.
With traction control as well.
Yeah, with traction control. I mean, this is something I've always puzzled me a bit because I first started watching F1 around 2007, 2008, and we still had the grooved tires. It surprised me how useless they were in the wet, even if it was very, very light rain. And you think, I get that slicks won't work, but it's technically a bit of tread. You'd think it would help a little, but it doesn't work. It's almost worse, which is interesting.
But the other thing about that is that they brought in the grooved tyres to reduce grip, because in 97 the grip had got too much. And then they bring in traction control. Just counterproductive, isn't it?
Okay, so I just wanted to jump in there and just say that when it comes to just the first few races of that season, it seemed like it was obvious that Ide was out of his depth. So, I mean, I'm not sure how deep we want to get into this, but I think the FIA's decision was effectively justified to revoke Ide's super license. It was clear that he was just completely out of his depth and a danger to the other drivers. So I didn't have an issue with that decision. And sent a message to the rest of the grid that, yes, you may be a small team, you may need marketing, but you can't just field anybody in your car. That's all I wanted to say there.
Yeah, because I'd never actually, my first encounter with Ide was from F1 Championship Edition, because I bought that game just as I started watching F1, and so I didn't recognize a lot of the drivers because it was the 2006 season. And I was like, I knew Sato, and I was like, Ide, who is this guy? I've never heard of him. And then I read up, and it explained that he only did 4 races. But he, obviously, the big one is Imola, where he dived down Albers at the start at Villeneuve and put him in a barrel roll in the gravel trap and left him upside down. But when it's interesting because now I think back and I'm like, he wasn't necessarily massively worse than, say, Mazepin, because Mazepin was, spinning a lot. He was cutting people off in testing, like he was trying to race against people. And then, he was blocking people in qualifying in Bahrain. He crashes 2 corners in. He managed to go for the whole season. But I suppose in his case, cash is king, maybe is the difference.
I mean, not only is cash king in that kind of thing, but I was just looking at his Formula 2 results. He was 5th in Formula 2 in 2020 and won a race. Won 2 races and got a smattering of second places here and there as well. So I think as much as we meme Mazepin for all of that stuff that he, crashing and being in by far the worst car on the grid, he at least was competitive in Europe and hadn't just come straight across from Japan, finishing 7th, 8th, 9th every year, if that makes any sense, because he's the talent pool in Europe is, it just is a lot higher than it is in most of the rest of the world.
I mean, okay, we're going off topic a bit, but Mazepin, he in F2, he was okay because I knew he was a bit aggressive and he won a couple of races, and I thought, okay, he's not bad. I mean, I wasn't expecting him to get the Haas seat. I thought it was going to go to Callum Ilott, and then we suddenly saw, okay, he's clearly not ready for this. But there wasn't. He looked like he was okay, but maybe just not quite F1 caliber, but not to be so far off. But it was he had a more impressive junior career than Ide. I mean, it depends if you would define Ide as still a junior, because things like what is now Super Formula, I wouldn't consider that to be a feeder series.
No,
it's not. It's a professional series in its own right. So it was. I think it was just his age to be in his early 30s. But it basically meant that after he pulled that move at the start of Imola, he then actually got demoted first to 3rd driver, and so from the next round it was their test driver Franck Montagny who got moved up to 2nd driver. He's someone who, he wasn't Japanese, he was French. He'd done Le Mans, he'd done some endurance racing before this, and since then he's done quite a lot of it. He's also famous for some other kind of substance-based offences as well he's had in more recent years. He did a 7 race stint with them. It wasn't the most exciting one from what I remember looking through. I mean, I think he had once or twice he got involved in accidents, but not, fairly unobtrusive, but much better than Ide on pace, certainly.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Montagny's stats because he's another one of these drivers that if you've played the games of the time, you'll recognise the name, but you won't recognise pretty much anything he's done because he disappeared pretty quickly. But I think what happened with Montagny is they brought him in to replace Ide because the FIA said send Ide down and get him as much testing as possible to make sure he can actually get some single-seater experience. But then they just basically went, this ain't happening, so we're just going to revoke his license. But apparently he's doing Chandhok's job now on French TV. So
Yeah.
He's one of those guys that seems a quite knowledgeable. You see it with these ex-footballers like Jermaine Genius wasn't exactly the best player in the world. He wasn't Messi, but he still gives a decent opinion on Match of the Day every other Saturday night. So it's like, well, now he's doing Formula E, isn't he? But it's he's one of those drivers that didn't have much of a career, but knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, Montagny was quite good. I mean, he was talented. He was Renault's test driver, if you recall, in 2003 as well. So he would be testing when Alonso and Trulli were the two main drivers. So I think he was considered to be competent. And I think the goal of bringing him over was to bring someone with some experience to support what was clearly a very inexperienced number 2 driver in that team. And that's the thing. I mean, I just want to touch on something you mentioned, Aidan. We do like to, as they say, meme some of the drivers now, but, Ide was one of the most classic cases, for example, of a driver being put in a position just because of marketing. Because being 5 seconds off any driver, being several seconds off your teammate, we haven't actually seen that in a while in F1. And, if you look at, I just want to go back to this, like Mazepin and Mick Schumacher, it was never that kind of a gap, ever. And the bottom line here is that I think Super Aguri had some competent drivers between Sato, Montagny, Davidson at one point or another. They just didn't field them in the correct way. And unfortunately, that cost them, literally. So Montagny was a good one. It would have been better to see maybe Montagny versus Sato throughout 2006. I think that would have been a good lineup for them. Marketing plus experience from Montagny's Renault time, but they didn't do that, obviously.
Yeah, he only did 6 races, I think, was the amount he did. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 races, and he only finished 3 of them. 16th, 18th, and 16th. Let me just have a quick click on one of these. French Grand Prix 2006, why not? He actually outqualified Sato at the French Grand Prix and was a lot closer in terms of pace by the looks of things.
Yeah. I think he has a story that he likes to talk about Montagny, where one testing session went quicker than Alonso, and Briatore was asking him, how he was doing that. So this is somebody who has talent, is competent, and should have probably been in that seat permanently if you're looking at it from a pure talent perspective. So then it's impressive, at his home race to outqualify the works driver, the regular driver. It's good stuff.
I'm just clicking on a few of these results now just to see where he was, because at Monaco he was only about a couple of tenths slower. The gap between him and Sato was tenths rather than seconds.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few of these drivers. I mean, Montagny, Davidson, Lauderer, the drivers that in one way or another you'd see them around the paddock, and you'd wonder, well, how come some of these other blokes are driving but they're not? But it becomes evident why not, because Formula One is more than just a pure meritocracy, whether we like to admit it or not. It's a huge marketing component that goes into this. And it doesn't shock me in the slightest that Montagny was able to jump in and match Sato right away, effectively. I mean, that's what we're saying here, right? I mean, those are pretty impressive results for somebody that didn't drive regularly. So probably a missed opportunity. Every point, every single tenth counts at that end of the grid. And yeah, I'm not too surprised that the marketing angle won out in the end. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, he. I suppose the main highlights from his very brief stint, because these are the only races he did in any Formula One car in the end for Montagny. I think Indianapolis, I think he was caught up in that huge pile-up at the start. And then
He was.
Sato crashed into Montero on like the third lap just after the safety car restart. At Monaco, he managed to keep Montero behind him for over 50 laps because at the start Montero got pushed into the wall and then pitted, and he kept him behind him for that long, and then he did eventually pass him when they were getting blue flags. But yeah, his pace was much closer to Sato's. And then comes Silverstone, they announced they have a new third driver, Sakon Yamamoto, and then only a few races later, Montagny gets bumped down and Yamamoto is put in the second seat, and they also debut their new car. So the SA05, which is one that was the Aros A23, was only meant to be a temporary stopgap while they were developing the new one, because I think they got Mark Preston was their technical director, so reasonably big name. They got this new car. It was effectively the same base car, but it had a lot of modifications to the aero, and it was immediately better because it was much closer to Midland on pace. Yamamoto, though, I've done a video on him. I'm probably the only person who's actually dedicated a video to him on YouTube. He's a very forgettable driver. He's now a politician, but his junior career was abysmal. He did German Formula 3 in 2003. I think he did the Formula 3 Euro Series in 2003. I think he finished 27th in the standings. And that was the year when I'm pretty certain Nico Rosberg won the title. He got one win in All Japan Formula 3 in 2004 and one win in what is now Super GT in 2005. And then he'd made his Grand Prix weekend debut with Jordan in 2005 at Suzuka. He got to drive on the Friday. His sponsors, there's somebody called Sanho Human Service. Can't find any information, but that's what I've been told they are. And they gave a very, very generous amount of money to allow him to get these kind of gigs. But they bring him in from Germany onwards, and he's well. The best way to say it is better than Ide, but worse than Montagny, maybe.
I'm just looking at that 2003 season. That grid was stacked. Ryan Briscoe won it overall, but you've got Briscoe, Klein, Olivier Pla, Winkelhock, Glock, Premer, Nico Rosberg, Bruno Spengler, Nicolas Lapierre, Robert Kubica, Adam Carroll, Jamie Green, Lucas Degrassi, Yamamoto 27th. Mauro Engel was on there, but he only did a couple of races. But the fact is that what happened with Yamamoto is that I think he did every race that season. There's a guy here called Marcel Lasset, did way fewer races. Jamie Green did way fewer races. Degrassi did way fewer races, but finished above him. So it's kind of like you're in. He was in a hornet's nest that year, but still way off where he probably should have been. I mean, he got a 10th place at the second race at the Hockenheim ring, but that grid was stacked, and he was just going to be entering it's like being like a newbie at one of the something like Call of Duty, and you go on against the proper esports guys, and you're just going to get absolutely obliterated.
He I think in All Japan Formula 3, I think he did beat Ide, so he has that at least. He could at least say, "Oh, I beat a future F1 driver," but it's not much of a flex. He's someone. I think a lot of his F1 opportunities came because of his relationship with Colin Collez. Because I think 2002 he was racing in German Formula 3 and he was driving for Bicoles Racing. 2005 was when Eddie Jordan had sold Jordan to Colin Collez, and he gets that Friday drive. And then after leaving Super Aguri, he races for Spiker, owned by Colin Collez, and then 3 years later races for HRT, team principal Colin Collez. So, I think a lot of the time it's not what you know, it's who you know is maybe the best description. But he got 4 retirements in a row. So it took a long time for him to even finish the checkered flag. I think most of those were mechanical, but he beached the car in the gravel in Turkey, even though he got up to 13th place on the first lap, because there was again a big pile-up which involved Sato, and he managed to stay out of trouble. But then he spun off on that. There was an interesting moment at China, actually, where at the very end of the race, Sato ended up causing an accident with Heidfeld and was it Barrichello or Button, like literally 2 corners before the end, they crash into each other because he's trying to do blue flags. And then Heidfeld goes up and confronts Yamamoto and shouts right in his face in front of the cameras because he thought he got them mixed up when it was actually Sato that did it.
Yeah, I'm just reading it now. Heidfeld started 8th on the grid, but through his strategy of pitting late at both pit stops, had rising to 4th in the closing stages, leapfrogging Barrichello, Button and Della Rosa. In the closing stages, Heidfeld was firstly forced off the track while trying to lap Christian Albers, and then held up by Sato Super Aguri, allowing Barrichello, Button and Della Rosa to close up. Button first managed to find his way past Barrichello on the last lap, then at the second last corner, boxed Heidfeld in behind Sato, taking 4th. Barrichello then braked too late at the same corner, running into the back of Heidfeld, knocking the right rear wheel off and damaging his own front wing. This allowed Della Rosa through to take 5th, Barrichello 6th, and Heidfeld limped home in 7th.
Yeah, that was a very unfortunate incident. As usual, Nick Heidfeld, pretty unlucky throughout most of his career. And there's that famous video online too where he's just going right up to Yamamoto thinking he's Takuma Sato and just yelling at him, calling him all sorts of obscenities. And a funny moment, but Nick should have probably done better, frankly, post race. Shouldn't be mixing up your competitors like that. Quick Nick, phenomenal driver. Maybe not so phenomenal on the driver identification side, but it just compounded what was just an unfortunate time for Yamamoto in Formula One. Kind of sums it up. Just a bit out of place and all a bit sad, really.
So basically, all year long, they Super Aguri had been the outright slowest team. They'd come nowhere near points, and then we got to Interlagos, and this was a very interesting race. So the season finale, because they were using Bridgestone tires, and again, this is when we had Bridgestone Michelin. For whatever reason, track temperatures just made those tires work to a T. Because Sato had an astonishing race, and he managed to beat both Midlands, both Toro Rossos, and a Red Bull outright, and finished 10th. Yamamoto still finished last, but he was right on Montero's tail, so he wasn't like a minute behind. So that gave them, it didn't improve their position in the constructors, but it meant that there was obviously something there in terms of the car's performance to have this really strong race out of nowhere.
Yes, I think a few things. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Super Aguri were on Bridgestone tires.
Yeah, they were.
And I think the Bridgestones worked well that weekend. You only have to see Massa's performance in that race and Michael Schumacher really tearing up the grid in the race. So I think he was on the right tire. And then I just find it hard to believe that the car was suddenly that much quicker at Brazil. And they weren't really bringing any updates. I mean, I think Sato just had a blinder and probably outdrove his car. I mean, I can't really point to anything else. I mean, unless either of you know that they brought developments or updates to that car late in the year, which I doubt they did given their budget. That to me, that seems more like a one-off, and primarily driven by Sato. Who was known to be a streaky driver, wasn't he? I mean, he'd have, 2 good races, and then he'd have 8 horrendous ones, judging by his VAR form. So he probably was just in good form and outperformed his car, as they say, frankly.
It was the 7th fastest car in the race as well that day.
Yeah, that was the lap times are amazing. This is another thing actually, because I don't think there were any updates. I think they brought hardly any updates in general all year. But yeah, the car was just working mostly because of the tires, and maybe the circuit characteristics suited it as well. But Yamamoto, he finished last. He set the 2nd fastest middle sector in the entire race. So yeah, clearly the car was working in low speed corners and tight corners. So it was finished last, but it was a very good performance from both of them. But it meant they still ended the season bottom of the constructors. They'd had some races where there were a few races earlier in the year, like 3 or 4 in a row, and I know this because of my own videos. They would pass both Midlands at the start and maybe keep ahead for like 5 or 10 laps and then fall behind. A lot of mechanical problems, a lot of hydraulics and gearboxes blowing up and being useless. 2007 was a very different story. They got rid of Yamamoto. In his place, they brought in Anthony Davidson, having originally thought about getting him for 2006, and he'd spent again 2006 as the test driver for Honda. They get him in alongside Sato. They actually got Vandergaard as their test driver. He was meant to be their test driver, and then he suddenly left them and joined Spiker, and they actually had to go to the contract recognition board who gave this to Spiker. And they kept their tradition of, taking another car and using it. This time they got their hands on Honda's 2006 car, which of course won a race with Button. And it showed, because in the very first race, I think both drivers made it into Q3. So it was clear that they were really on the up now.
Yeah, it says here that they managed to get through. Although, it has to be said though that Spiker filed a formal protest against this particular car because of the fact that they basically got last year's Honda. They referred to, it says here, Articles 2.1, 2.2, and 6.3 of the regulations basically say the constructor has to build everything in-house and can't just buy a new chassis. This is what actually stopped ProDrive entering around this time, because they wanted to buy cars from McLaren, but then the FIA said, no, you can't do that. So they sort of canned the idea of coming in. So it turns out that Super Aguri owned the intellectual property rights to the car. So unless that when they bought it, they bought the IP as well, while Honda moved on to the 2007 car. I managed to dodge it that way.
That's not even the first time we've seen a team do that. I mean, Sauber did that, didn't they?
Sauber did it for about 20 years, didn't they? Buying Ferrari.
Yeah, forever. Yeah. So, I mean,
Force
we've done before.
Pink Mercedes, yeah. I mean, even that year it happened again, because most famously with Toro Rosso, because Toro Rosso's 2006 car was the Red Bull RB1 from the year before, and it had the same engine, because they're famously the last team to have a V10 engine, and they just had to rev limit it so it wasn't overpowered compared to the V8s. In 2007, the Toro Rosso STR2, it was exactly the same as the Red Bull RB3, except it had a Ferrari engine instead of a Cosworth one. But Adrian Newey, in his everlasting wisdom, found a loophole, because technically he was employed by Red Bull Technologies, not Red Bull Racing. So that was a third party had designed both of those cars, which meant that technically the two teams did not own their own cars. So that way it wasn't them stealing another team's car. It was just that they were sort of hiring their cars from a third party. So they found a very clever loophole. Toro Rosso kept that until, I think, 2009, they shut this down completely. 2010 even, because the 2010 Toro Rosso was a completely independent car. Whereas the 08 Toro Rosso that beat Red Bull, exactly the same car, but with a year-old Ferrari engine, and then in the hands of Vettel, ended up being better. And then the 2009 Toro Rosso, exactly the same as the Red Bull, Ferrari engine, but the Red Bull is the fastest car, and the Toro Rosso is the slowest car. And that's how much difference the engine can make, it seems. Yeah, so they had this race-winning 2006 Honda now. And it was very funny, because it meant that they, for the first few races, certainly, they were actually beating Honda with their own car.
Yeah, because the Honda in 2007 was an utter dog, wasn't it?
Yeah. It looks stunning. I mean, a lot of people hate that Earth Dreams livery. I think it's magnificent. I think it looks amazing. But yeah, the car was diabolically bad.
I think Honda didn't score a single point that year, did they?
I think they got 1 point. I'm sure there must have been 1 or 2, because they got a podium in 2008.
Yeah, so because Barrichello managed to finish second or third at the British Grand Prix in 2008.
Yeah, he finished third. They got a few points in 2008, but 07, I think maybe only 1 point. I get the feeling it was at somewhere like China or Fuji.
They got them at the French Grand Prix, Italian Grand Prix, and Chinese. They got 6 versus Super Aguri's 4.
So that's better than I thought it was then. Yeah, no, it was Spiker that got 1 point.
Yeah.
And that was because of that came at Fuji, and that was only because of Liuzzi got disqualified, or he got a grid penalty. He finished 8th, and then also Vettel had crashed into Webber, so that ended up being a train wreck for Toro Rosso. But then they got double point finish in China. Yeah, it was obvious the car was good in 2007, and then the first points came in 2000 in Spain, where Sato finished 7th. And you can see this because actually he just got lapped by whoever won that race. I think it was Alonso, wasn't it, that won? Because that's the race where Raikkonen had his engine failure for the lead.
It was Raikkonen. Oh, or Massa.
Massa won in Spain.
Yeah.
I didn't know Massa won in Spain. I thought he only won like Turkey, Brazil, and Bahrain, ones like that.
Bahrain,
no, he
Turkey.
put it on pole. He put it on pole as usual, because he only won from first or second, as we know, and he put it on pole in Spain. Drove Alonso off the road in turn 1. Alonso dropped to 4th, and Massa won that race. But again, don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole, but yes, he did win that race. I remember that very well. So
we've covered the Massa rabbit hole in a few other episodes already. But yeah, no, it's only because it's funny because at the end of, I'm trying to remember the details of that race. At the very end, obviously, it shows Massa crossing the finish line. He just lapped Sato, and you can see Sato just behind him. He's cheering with the mechanics on the pit wall because they've just scored their first points. So that was a huge moment. But Davidson, at this point, because he was new to the team for the first half of the season, he was actually basically the stronger driver because I remember this from a lot of the interviews. Sato had a lot of problems adjusting to that car, even though he scored points in it. Whereas Davidson had effectively spent a year testing it because it was the 06 car, and he was really on top of it, but he just didn't he finished 14th a lot, but he just never had any races where points could end up coming for him, unfortunately.
And I just want to jump in here because this guy is one of the most underrated drivers ever. And I really mean that. I remember reading about Anthony Davidson, Jenson Button, Dan Weldon in the junior categories, and everyone thought Anthony was the quickest, or let's say the best racer of that group. And for some reason or another, he never got a proper chance in Formula One, in my opinion. So it wasn't surprising to me because I rate Davidson higher than Sato as a driver. I really do, as a pure driver. And he did a stunning job, given that he just jumped into a car, having not really driven as much as Sato had up to that point in Formula One. And of course, we can get to this. he put in probably one of the best qualifying laps I've ever seen from a back marker in that Turkish Grand Prix in that qualifying session. I can't remember exactly where he qualified in Turkey, but Anthony Davidson's Turkey 2007 qualifying lap in the Super Aguri is the stuff of legends. It's an amazing lap. It put him close to the top 10, I believe. And, it's just another what could have been for him and also for Super Aguri. They should have been putting somebody like that as the lead driver from the start to lead the project because Anthony was that good, and he just again, wrong place, wrong time. But it's not a surprise to me to see him matching and even exceeding Sato. I rate him higher.
So I'm looking at the results now. Davidson only beat Sato twice all year when both cars finished.
Yeah,
Turkey and Monza.
Yeah, I'd have to look deeper into why that is. Maybe reliability, maybe incidents, but maybe Davidson had some bad races too. But I do remember early on he was matching, if not exceeding. And honestly, people remember Super Aguri in 2007 because of Sato and Alonso in Canada. I actually remember Davidson's qualifying lap in Turkey. Where did he qualify in Turkey? Again, I just don't remember.
11th, and I think he was 9th in Q1.
Yeah, it was just some kind of crazy lap, and there's an onboard of it, and when he crosses the line, he knows it's a phenomenal lap because he starts banging the steering wheel in just pure elation, knowing he had just done something very special. And anybody, when I was watching at the time, I thought to myself, wow, that's one of those laps you don't forget. And it was that good, really. I encourage all our listeners to try and find that lap online and watch it because I believe it's the best lap ever done in a Super Aguri. But
was-
okay, to Aidan's point, Sato maybe beat him in the races there head to head.
Yeah, Davidson did a 128.002 in that session. He was only like 0.2 off Fisichella's Renault.
Alonso's a 126.8, so
Yeah.
1.2 seconds off the fastest time. But in a car that was effectively a year old.
Yeah.
And had
No, it was
kind of,
Sunny.
and in 2006 had kind of towed the line between front runner and upper midfielder. Yeah, it was. I mean, I think we do need to mention Canada a bit. I mean, yeah, obviously amazing performance at the end from Sato. I think he was on fresher tyres. I mean, it was one of those races where obviously Lewis got his first win. Alonso just had a bit of a train wreck. I think he was running very old tyres. But Sato makes that move on him. Very tidy move in the days before DRS as well. Anthony Davidson, I think he was running in third at one point, but then he hit a groundhog on the back straight, and then he pitted immediately, and the team were not ready, so he was stuck in the pit lane for like 40 seconds, and he finished the race in 11th. But I don't know if he would have finished on the podium even without the groundhog, but things were really working for them, and that was a huge shame. That he's a driver who should have scored points, but just through circumstance never did.
I mean, in that race, Alonso, because 2007 it was Alonso and Hamilton, wasn't it? Because Hamilton was this new hotshot that had come in, and there was that whole Hamilton's better than Alonso thought he would be. So at the start, Hamilton defended from Alonso. Alonso went wide, Heidfeld went through, and Alonso, I think he damaged his floor going across the grass, and that's why he was slow. But even then, a slightly damaged McLaren should have held off a 1-year-old Honda.
I mean, he was more than slow, wasn't he? He just kept driving off the circuit. I mean, he went off at turn 1 4 times in that race. Shocking performance. And then he went bad-mouthing his team after the race as well, typical. But anyways, I mean, he had a tough race, and getting passed by a Super Aguri in any circumstance, pretty unacceptable. But that was a thrilling race, and I think that's the moment most people remember from Super Aguri, this underdog image of, a team against the odds managing to pass the reigning world champion that year.
I remember James Allen on the commentary getting really excited about it because he was like, hang on, he's dealt with, I think it was like Heidfeld's BMW, and now he fancies a crack at the world champion in the McLaren. And he just stuck it down the inside like it wasn't there, like it was like Schumacher's 2004 Ferrari on a Jordan or something. But there's actually on the wiki page for this particular race, there's a picture of Sato's Super Aguri right up the arse of Alonso's McLaren at turn 2. It's a brilliant picture.
Yeah, Alonso was running into things that day, wasn't he?
He had a mare.
So Sato, he had a mare of a race, and Sato capitalized on that. Fair credit to him. It was a great moment. I enjoyed it. I loved it. And,
it's a video idea.
So there you go.
It was one of the few races that year where they did actually go forwards in the race, because Super Aguri, they had a tendency to qualify well and then drift behind, because you mentioned they're making Q3 a few times but they're not scoring points. In this one, Sato and Davidson, they qualified 11th and 17th and then finished 6th and 11th when they easily could have had both of them in the points. It is the modern equivalent of this would be if we go to Canada again. If it would be like Albon passing Verstappen in the dying stages of a race. Again, that's one of Williams' strong circuits with long straights. It has that kind of magnitude, I suppose to it. But they kept both drivers for the whole season. So there weren't any move mixes up or anything. But the thing is, as the season went on, the team did gradually get weaker. I think, again, it was just lack of updates. And even though they had started the season beating Honda, they did get beaten by Honda in the end, because Honda got 6 points and Super Aguri got 4, but it did give them 9th in the Constructors' Championship, partly because they beat Spiker, who the year before had been Midland, and then also, of course, the Spygate disqualification for McLaren.
Yeah, I mean, can you really say, though, that you know, we expected anything differently. I mean, we've all mentioned here, they didn't really bring any updates, did they? And in Formula One, I mean, yes, there was limited testing in 2007. It was the first year testing restrictions were severely reduced. Sorry, testing restrictions were severely increased, I should say. And so thus, people thought, okay, that would help Super Aguri because Ferrari and McLaren can't just do all the testing they want at their private sessions and spend more money to test. But ultimately, it showed us that even with less testing, you need a budget. You need technical expertise. You can't just, you can't just stand still in Formula One because standing still is the same as falling behind in this sport anyways. So it didn't surprise me, frankly, but it is a shame because I would have liked to see more underdog performances like we saw in Canada. It was only good for the sport. I think everybody loved that. So it was a bit of a shame, as you say.
Another thing that's come to mind, I probably should mention this probably as part of the reason that they struggled so much, was actually midway through 2007. Their lead sponsor, SS United, had started defaulting on payments and they were let go. I don't know what SS United is. It sounds like a mixture of like a bank or an airline or something like that, or I don't know. But yeah, that was the one sponsor they kept throughout their 3 years, Samantha Kings. That was something that appeared on the car every year. I have no clue what Samantha Kings is, but yeah, SS United, they lost their main sponsor, so I think that was this is when the money problems really started to kick in.
SS United was a Hong Kong-based oil and gas company.
Ah, okay. So that's a lot of
according to Autosport.
Yeah,
I love the Autosport archives.
I think that the question is like, what else could they have really done in that position? You're kind of in a tough spot there when you have such a low budget. Your main sponsor starts defaulting on payments. The writing's on the wall at that point. Really, doesn't matter who your drivers are. So it's unfortunate that it happened, and I applaud them for sticking around even through that. That can never be easy. I mean, imagine the demoralizing effect that has on mechanics and engineers when every single weekend it could be your last in effect when your main sponsor is defaulting on payments and you're in a bit of a cash crunch. So it only makes me actually respect them more when I hear that because that team seemed to be a team that had a lot of pride, and the drivers definitely didn't take it easy, so to speak. So respectable. Even with all those headwinds, let's say, it's just a shame that it didn't go to plan.
Yeah, so it meant they had what, broadly speaking, was a good 2007, which just ended in very difficult terms. Then comes 2008. This regrettably did not last very long. I mean, I'd started watching F1 properly from Bahrain onwards, so I only really saw Super Aguri for 2 races. I knew who they were because I played Championship Edition, the game, and I knew that they'd been around for a little bit. But I think as well as losing their main sponsor, one of the biggest problems they had was that they continued their tradition of using other cars. They went from using the 06 Honda to the 07 Honda, which they had been beating. So that really was not the best way to start your campaign.
Yeah, using a car that was not that good. It's like buying a. What would it be in modern terms? It would be like
it's like bringing
Haas trying to use like their 2021 car again.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make any sense, but it does when you look at it because they were obviously just. I think they just didn't have the resources to do anything different, frankly. And usually we see that with teams that had a successful season or completely updated their car from the previous year. We saw it with Ferrari. Ferrari did that, didn't they? In the beginning of the 2000s, they brought the 2001 Ferrari for the first few races of 2002, and then they brought the 2002 Ferrari for the first few races of 2003. The 2007 Super Aguri was not the 2002 Ferrari, was it? No. So it was probably closer to the 2002 Arrows.
Mm.
than the 2002 Ferrari. And yeah, I think, yeah.
Ferrari did the same thing. They did that again in 2005. They used the F2004, but the thing is, they actually bumped up their 05 car early because the 04 car was not working out for them, and then but not that the 05 car was any better. But yeah,
right. Well, I think the problem is that 05 was a tricky season. I think the tires also didn't help Ferrari in 05, but the problem is that with Super Aguri, again, what can you hope to achieve if you're not trying to push the envelope in some way? I mean, they're already cash strapped, main sponsor defaulting on payments. They're not developing their own car, really. They're just using last year's car. I think it was no surprise to anyone watching at the time that this team there was a ticking clock on their lifeline, basically. This wasn't sustainable.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, they were like those sort of late 80s, beginning of 90s teams that showed up and were only around for a little bit of a time, or even like someone like Lotus towards sort of 93, 94, where they're just on life support. I mean, I'm looking at it's like some of the more detailed history here that Super Aguri's problems with this gas company or whoever it was started just before that 2007 race at Canada, which was like their best performance ever, and they just sort of just went into a nosedive after that. And it's kind of like, well, it's a case of when they go bust rather than if. And there was an attempt at a partial takeover by something called the Magma Group. It says an unspecified portion of it was taken over. And then they tried to get a driver with some money, but he went to ART and GP2. But they did the launch, they did the preseason testing, they did all of that stuff. But then they cancelled the preseason test or cancelled turning up because parts hadn't arrived. And it's like, yes, we will be there in Australia, but then the proposed takeover then fell through. And it's actually said here that there were rumours that Bernie gave them a chunk of money just to keep them alive a tiny bit longer so they could find a new investor.
Yeah, I mean, that's just shocking, really. I mean, the thing is that you got to even look at it from Honda's perspective. What's the point of having a B team that's, so far behind? You don't really benefit from it. I mean, Honda could have maybe stepped in and given them some cash if they really believed in that project, And even Honda was reluctant to do that.
I think they were a B team in name only, though.
Right.
Not in the same way that Toro Rosso was to Red Bull.
Yeah, but I know, but like Honda maybe could have looked at that and said that, look, we could make these guys like a proper B team and invest in them and say, well, look, this could be beneficial to us. But at that point, remember, Honda was even considering their involvement in the sport, weren't they? Because the season market crash. Exactly. That's another great point, right? That 2008 was a brutal year to be going through that. I mean, if you were already cash strapped, there was no way you're going to get cash after GFC, the Great Financial Crisis. So everything just went against them in a way that year, I suppose. And the writing was on the wall, wasn't it? It's a great point.
So yeah, it meant that they did only 4 races. I mean, those 4 races were fairly inconspicuous ones. I mean, the first race, chaotic race in Australia, where we saw only 7 finishers at the end. Davidson, he got caught up in that mess at the start. He got wedged in between a couple of cars and broke his suspension. Sato, he managed to carry on. I think the engine died halfway through the race, but he was running around in last place. They did both finish Malaysia, Bahrain, but they were last. And then Spain, this is where you could see they were in trouble because they brought all of their sponsors had gone and they had a new livery that had much less red and a lot more white. So they suddenly had this very different looking car in Spain. Davidson, he got a piece of gravel punctured a hole in his radiator and that ended his race. And then Sato finished 13th. But yeah, so four fairly inconspicuous races where they were basically slower than Force India in each of them.
I think that was the race where Massa ended up in a wall about 4 times and then blew his engine up trying to catch back up to everybody. It was a mental race all around that one. again, that's another one I need to do a video on because it's like, oh yeah, that happened.
Or talking about Australia there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, Massa spun, didn't he, in the first corner too?
yeah.
he hit
Um,
Vettel
even-
and took him out.
Yeah, well done, Felipe. You know, but
But Singapore's where he
he
lost it.
Yeah, I mean, he lost it. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but he lost it in numerous places, starting from race
Yeah.
one. Remember, traction control was banned. Everybody said Massa would not enjoy the absence of traction control, and he did spin in the first corner of the first race. So by himself, nobody tagged him. He just spun by himself. Anyways, but Massa, unlike the Super Aguri boys, was in a mega car, wasn't he? Relatively so. Credit to the Super Aguri guys for fighting and pulling through. It was such a sad moment. I remember when Anthony Davidson, I can't remember what the situation was, but he went back to the garage. I think it was in Spain, and he hugged the mechanics, didn't he? There was that scene where he was going around hugging each of his Super Aguri mechanics, and you just felt like he knows this is the end, and it could be the end of his career too.
He's a very nice guy.
Yeah. Mm.
I sort of had a limited interaction with him during the pandemic races that the race did. And it was only like a small thing because we were all in a WhatsApp group, and like I've still got some of their numbers and things like that. And I just clanged into him coming out of the pit, so I just went, "Oh, sorry, I hit you," and he's just like, "Oh yeah, mate, don't worry about it. It's all good. It's just a game and all that stuff." So he's a really nice guy, and he comes across that way on TV as well. So he's one of those guys that will go quite far in his media career. But like you say, he was in that group with Dan Weldon and Jenson Button coming up through the ranks, and Weldon won the Indy 500. What was it, twice? Button won the World Championship, and Davidson's the one that's doing punditry as his career now.
The consensus was between those three. I don't want to go too far off the path here, but Jenson was, let's say, the bloke who would control the race from the front and was potentially just able to do a Vettel in the juniors every career where he could just drive away. But Anthony was the one where everybody thought didn't matter where he started, he was the best racer in the junior categories. He could pass everybody. He was fast. He was mature. And so everybody actually expected Anthony to be as good, if not better, than Jenson Button. His career didn't play out like that. And that's why he had the nickname Unlucky Ant.
Just looking at his juniors, British Formula Ford Winter Series first, British Formula Ford, which at that point was really prestigious, third, Formula Ford Festival first, British Formula 3, which at the time really prestigious, second, European Formula 3 2001, won it, Masters of Formula 3 third. He just ended up in really terrible teams.
Yeah,
or as a tester.
Yeah, he was just so unlucky. I don't understand why nobody gave him a full-time drive earlier in his career. I really don't. You have somebody like that who was easily better than 75% of the grid in the early 2000s. And this is a clear case. This is another case of where marketing comes into play. You could be a super talent. Anthony Davidson is actually the perfect example of somebody who deserved to be in good cars, or at least better cars than he was, but the marketing and business angle of F1 prevented him from doing so. He's a perfect example of that.
I would have expected him to go to Toyota at some point, but he didn't. He would have done all right at Toyota.
I don't know. I mean, he'd been connected to Honda his whole career because he'd been a BAR reserve and test driver since 2000. So he'd been with them a long time. He'd had a couple.
That'll explain it then.
I mean, he did do 2 races with Minardi in 2002. He did one with BAR. I've noticed. Yeah, he did do a race with BAR in 2005. It was Malaysia. I think Sato was unwell. That was the reason for that. I think there was something funny going on in that race with him. So he did stand in once or twice, but he done 2004. He did a whole year third driver, drove in Friday practice every single race. He did the same thing in 2006. Which is probably why he was so comfortable with the car in 07. There is actually something, if you can find it, I would recommend watching it, is that in 2008, a documentary came out called Life Behind Lewis, and it basically covered his 2007 year with Super Aguri, and just shows how different it was compared to Lewis's year with McLaren. And it shows, for example, the French Grand Prix. Hamilton flies there on a private jet, and Davidson has to drive himself from Lee Field, their factory, all the way to Manicourt in France to get to the race. It just shows how different things were at opposite ends of the grid.
Sato had a favour for that Malaysia Grand Prix.
Okay. But
it's sad. It's just sad to hear that, though, Peter. I'm sorry. I mean, it's not fair in a way, because and I don't want to put down Sir Lewis Hamilton. I mean, he's obviously beyond impressive for most of his career, but there's no way Anthony Davidson should have been in that kind of a position. He really, really had the talent to win races in Formula One. So it just shows how brutal the sport can be, you know.
Yeah, because it was they did what actually happened, because after they did Spain, that was their last race. They actually went to Turkey, but they got turned away at the gates, because I think at this point, because the money had run out, and Nick Fry, who was CEO of Honda, was just like, no, you're not allowed to race. So they were still willing to try, and they still had the infrastructure, but they just got turned away. I think I remember very, very vaguely now. I think it was at that race that they actually still interviewed both drivers together, Sato and Davidson, just to ask for an explanation of what happened. But yeah, I remember I was only a few races into being an F1 fan properly, and I was quite bummed that they'd gone, even in the interest of symmetry, because if they'd seen out the whole season, that would have been our first season where we had it was the same drivers from start to finish, and we didn't get that until I don't think 2018 that happened. So that alone, even if they would have still finished last, I would have liked to have seen them see out the season.
Yeah. Underdogs are always fan favorites, right? So I think everybody was a bit sad when they folded.
So there was, after they folded, they went into administration. I think there was an attempt by Adrian Campos to buy the team out, and he would go on to form HRT 2 years later, but that ended up not happening. Davidson, he got to go right back to Brackley and stayed there, and I think he still does simulator work for Mercedes to this day. So he was there in the Brawn years and since Mercedes, and he's been connected to Brackley for over 20 years now. Sato, he did a test with Toro Rosso to try and get a seat in 2009, but then lost that to Buemi and went to the States. He's won IndyCar twice, not IndyCar, the Indy 500 twice. I think these days he's not so popular. Like, I think there wasn't there a few races ago or last year, he caused some massive accident at one of the ovals, and everyone was like, why is this guy still here or something? So he's a bit less popular now, but yeah. They both had plenty to do after Super Aguri folded.
Well, Davidson did all right at Le Mans, didn't he? Toyota.
I don't think he won it, did he? Or
he won the World Endurance Championship with Toyota.
Yeah.
Sato won, as you said, Indy 500 twice, which was both the years that Alonso made it to the grid. Which is
another punch there.
Another punch in the face for
Fernando. I mean, again, Davidson was just so unlucky because he did so much work with that Le Mans project, and the moment Alonso expressed some interest, they dropped Davidson and put Alonso in that seat, and they won Le Mans that year, didn't they? But Toyota were going to win it anyways. They were so dominant in that.
The only LMP1 on the grid at that point, weren't they? Pretty much.
Yeah.
So, just more unfortunate developments for Anthony Davidson, a recurring theme throughout his career. But, I mean, if I were to look back and say, where do I rank Super Aguri among all the backmarker teams of this century? I mean, I'd actually rank them higher than most because they showed heart. They had some memorable moments. They faced a lot of adversity in terms of economic pressure, in terms of just, being able to finance themselves properly. And they gave us lasting memories. They gave us entertainment. They showed us that, you can be in a Super Aguri and drive the best lap in a session like Anthony Davidson did in Turkey. You can be in a Super Aguri and pass the reigning world champion like Sato did in Canada. And so I give them credit for that. I don't think it was a complete failure as a project, but it certainly was nowhere near as successful as one would have hoped.
Technically, the team still exists as well, because it says here that the assets were bought by Formtech, which is a German composites company, and they have a factory in Leafield, which is the old Arrows base, which then became Super Aguri's base, and like they still run out of there. So like if Super Aguri was ever to be resurrected, as it were, it's all there. But it also says that Formtech tried to enter in 2010 with those 3 new teams that were brought in under false pretenses of budget caps and stuff like that, which is probably an episode for you to do in the future if you haven't already done it. And we tried to enter with the Brabham name, which is another name that's been dragged through the courts in one way or another recently, with it's like who owns the rights to this and that. And so we could have had Brabham back on the grid, but using the Super Aguri bits and bobs at one point, which would have been interesting. And Brabham is a name that I've been doing a bit of stuff with lately, which is interesting. Which is hopefully should be doing some stuff with that later this year, which would be great.
That Formtech, I think that must be a different factory, because the Leafield factory that Super Aguri used, it was abandoned after they left, but then Caterham used it from 2012 to 2014. And then it got abandoned again, because that's the one that sometimes people go and do kind of urban exploration vids looking around it. It might have been repossessed recently, I heard, and it's being done up again. But the factory, that factory has been, Arrow Super Aguri.
Oh, it's a different one, is it?
Yeah, Arrow Super Aguri and Caterham have all used that factory at some point. Yeah, I mean, you can still find a bit of legacy of the team around. I mean, I know that the 07 and 08 cars, I think they're kept at like the Honda Museum in Japan. They have them on display there. The 06 ones, I know that one of them is being run in the Boss GP series at the moment by a guy called Wolfgang Jaksch. So there's footage of it being used at like Imola and stuff. So that one still gets used. There was another one that was used. It was bought by, I think, Marussia, and they turned it into a show car, because there is a Super Aguri with Marussia livery, and this is the one that was used. It'll come to me. It was a show. It was this show on Sky that involved a bunch of comedians, and they would do some tests and trial type things, and they got them all to drive that car around Silverstone. Bloody James Corden was one of them, and what was the name of the show? There was that footballer as well.
Was it A League of Their Own?
A League of Their Own, yeah, that was the one.
Yeah.
And so they got them to drive this what is obviously a Super Aguri, but painted in Marussia colours. So something. So that's a little bit funny. And also, if you're like me, you can find merchandise like this shirt. Every so often turns up.
Is that an eBay job?
I think it was eBay, or I got it new. It was like unopened. So maybe someone bought it at one of their auctions and just never used it. And yeah, so you can still.
Somebody in Japan paid 85 grand for one of the cars.
Yes, yeah, there was a private buyer who bought another one of the 06 cars. But 85, that's really cheap. I mean, I'd be amazed if that includes the engine, because the engine alone would add probably a couple of hundred onto that.
Yeah,
a couple of $100 grand.
Unless it's just the shell.
Yeah,
no gearbox,
the one in the Boss GP series has the Honda V8, so that's the original car.
Yeah.
But yeah, Boss GPs are different. That's a funny series, Boss GP. The only title that Mahavir Raghunathan has, beating a bunch of middle-aged dentists and CEOs that have just bought an F1 car to race for fun at the weekends. And yeah,
I met the guy who races the it might be the Lotus 79 in one of those historic series. I met him at Silverstone because I went out in a radical around there, which pretty much broke my neck. It's insane how much grip it had. Yeah. And he said, like, driving that thing, it's just like, it's almost digital with the grip. And like the guys who are obviously like newer, younger, our age type of guys driving these death traps from the 70s where the crumple zone is your knees. And then like doing like these historical things. It's like, what happens if you write one of these things off? Like you're writing off a car that's worth easily a couple of million.
Yeah, I mean, he must have paid a fortune to get his hands on a 79 because those things are priceless now.
I think
yeah,
it's a
I know
private
that.
owner, but he drives it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, you'd never be able to buy one of those out of your own pocket. No, I mean, the 79, it is an amazing car. It's one of my favorites from F1 history. I know that Barrichello actually drove it at the Goodwood Festival of Speed in 2000, and he said this is amazing. Like it's got as much grip as this year's Ferrari. Like that's how good it was, just because of the ground effect. Yeah, it still had a Ford Cosworth DFV, so it only had about 400 horsepower. Give it more grunt, and it could have put some really, really mega lap times in.
That's massively impressive, and looping it all together, closing a loop on this. I mean, I think that something that needed more grunt was basically all the Super Aguri cars from 2006 to 2008. And I'm wondering if I had to ask you guys, what was your favorite Super Aguri car? What was your favorite Super Aguri driver / moment? What your guys' views would be on that? I'm curious to hear, like, what your lasting impression is of that team there.
Well, my favorite car is the 06 one. I think it looks the best. That tribal livery is fantastic, and the car's just the lines and the shape of the car is good. And also, that's the one that most people, if you play F1 Championship Edition, that's the car most people start with. I think my favorite driver overall is Sato. He's someone who is just he's always been massively popular. I knew his name before I really started watching F1 properly. And yeah, he was just known to be a very exciting driver. Similar to Kobayashi in that he could pull off some amazing passes, but then also cause some huge accidents if the pass didn't work out so well. Yeah, and I like most people, that their real highlight moment is Canada, the move on Alonso.
Yeah, I'd say Canada's probably their best moment, most memorable moment, and I think the 07 car is probably the one I associate most with it, because it was that car that Sato did that pass on Alonso with. So, I mean, I've got a picture of it up here on my other screen. It's just like, it's actually next to the 2006 Honda, and it's like, yeah, they're pretty much the same car.
Impressive. Yeah. I mean, it's just such a classic underdog moment. The slowest car on the grid passing what was probably the quickest car in the grid, certainly the car with the most mechanical grip on the grid. And teams come and go. I know Peter has a lot of knowledge on like HRT, for example, but if you compare HRT to Super Aguri, and you tell me which one was more memorable, Peter. I mean, it was definitely Super Aguri. I mean, between us three, we can remember Super Aguri moments, and we don't need to research them, right? Like, we can remember Canada 2007. I can't really remember too many moments from back markers of that level without having to research them. You know what I mean? And it speaks to the team. It speaks to the team, really does.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that HRT, Super Aguri's memorable moments are the good moments where they, beat Alonso and score points. Whereas to the casual observer, a team like HRT, the only memorable things they would remember would be things like Carter Kayan giving Vettel a puncture and getting called a cucumber. It's stuff like that. It's not the good stuff. And that's the thing, is that Super Aguri, they did have the good stuff. It was, they accomplished, considering their budget and resources, they accomplished a lot in a relatively short space of time, I'd say. I think that brings this episode to a close. Always good to talk about HRT. I mean, I do enjoy talking about backmarket teams. But yeah, thank you as ever to Ciaron. And thank you to Aidan for joining us. I imagine most of our viewers will probably know who you are, but where can they find you on the airwaves?
Just literally type my name into the YouTube search bar and I'll pop up. It's even if people do spell it with an E, even though it's in big letters at the start of every video of what my name is. But yeah, that's where I am. Getting close to 100k. So if I can chav a few of Peter's viewers, that'd be great.
And if I can chav a few of your viewers to get me to 50.
You're only at 50?
I just passed 30, but my target for the end of this year is 50. But I'll see if that's quite a big task, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I thought
Unless I get
more than
very
that.
lucky.
But we were saying earlier that we don't watch each other's stuff, so it's like that's not like because we don't like each other. It's just we don't want to steal each other's words, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where to find me. I upload Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Today's video, this is Wednesday, so I've got to upload that at some point. So yeah, I just upload videos. That's what I do. Yeah, I'm a very boring person.
Yeah. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.